James finds himself face to face with someone who knows his every secret, his future self. The man has come back to warn him of a catastrophic destiny and the chance to rewrite fate. Welcome to today's time travel adventure. 15 years ago, James lost his parents in a tragic plane crash, a moment that forever altered his life. Since then, he has dedicated himself obsessively to a single mission: cracking the code of time travel. A brilliant yet introverted scientist, James spends nearly every waking hour in his makeshift lab, tucked away in the garage of the house he shares with his sister, Meredith. Both siblings live a solitary existence, bound by the shared grief of their parents' untimely death. James keeps their ashes carefully preserved, a silent testament to his unwavering determination to undo the past. James's devotion to his work leaves little room for anything else. He isolates himself from the world, consumed by equations and experiments, chasing the faint hope that he might rewrite history. His closest connection is Courtney, a colleague and friend who works alongside him in the same research facility. One evening, Courtney visits James at home, concerned about his relentless pace and deteriorating health. "You can't keep pushing yourself like this," she pleads, watching him with a mix of admiration and frustration. "You've been working on this for so long, James. Don't let it destroy you." James, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights, waves off her concern. "I'm close, Courtney, closer than I've ever been. I can feel it." Courtney sighs, knowing that James's work is his entire world. Despite her feelings for him, she has long accepted that his obsession leaves little room for anything or anyone else. Summoning her courage, she delivers the news. "I came to tell you, I've accepted a job in Switzerland. It's a better opportunity, and I'll be leaving in a few days." Her words hang in the air, but James barely reacts, his thoughts already drifting back to his formulas and theories. Disappointed but unsurprised, Courtney leaves, knowing that her departure will barely register in his world of numbers and calculations. After she's gone, James retreats to his garage lab, the only place he feels alive. The dimly lit space hums with machinery and the faint glow of computer screens, the culmination of years of tireless effort. Meredith, worried for her brother, but used to his single-minded focus, leaves him alone, as she always does. Meredith tells James that he should finally let go of his parents' deaths and immerse their ashes tomorrow. She reminds him that it's been 15 years since they passed and urges him to move forward with his life. However, James refuses and walks out. After leaving, James books a cab from a coffee shop to go home. He stays completely focused on his work, ignoring everything around him. While in the cab, the driver tries to start a conversation, saying he has something very important to tell James. But James, still buried in his work, doesn't respond. Suddenly, the cab stops in a deserted area. Confused, James looks around, wondering why the driver stopped there. That's when he notices the car window is shattered. He realizes he was so distracted by his work that he didn't even notice what had happened. Alarmed, James senses something is wrong and decides to run away from the car. The driver shouts after him, saying he just wants to talk, but James doesn't listen. He keeps running until he finds the road ahead is blocked. Before he can figure out what to do, the driver catches up to him and knocks him unconscious with a shock device. When James wakes up, he's surprised to find himself in his own lab. He notices that he's restrained with magnetic handcuffs. Standing before him is the cab driver, who seems oddly familiar. James demands to know who he is, why he knocked him out, and how he ended up back at his own lab. The man calmly explains that he has traveled back in time and that he is actually James, an older version of him from the future. The older James tells him that tomorrow, his boss, Adna, will announce a major project, and James will present his time travel theory. But he warns the younger James not to go to the lab or submit the theory. He explains that creating the time machine will lead to a life of loneliness and regret. The invention, while groundbreaking, will ruin everything for him. Young James finds it hard to believe and thinks it must be some kind of joke or prank. The old man, seeing James's disbelief, begins revealing secrets only James could know. He talks about how James and his sister, Meredith, still carry their parents' ashes in necklaces around their necks. He also reveals that James has been working tirelessly for 15 years to build a time machine so he could travel back and save his parents. Hearing these deeply personal details, James begins to believe that this man might truly be his future self and that he must have successfully built a time machine someday. Just as James starts to process this revelation, Meredith arrives unexpectedly and accuses the old man of being a thief. She announces that she's already called the police to deal with him. The old man quickly writes down an address and hands it to James, saying it's crucial. Then he flees before the police arrive. When the police reach James's house, they question him about the incident. To protect the old man's identity, James decides not to reveal the truth. He lies, telling the officers that the intruder was just a thief and that there's no need to press charges. The police, surprised by James's refusal to file a report, leave their contact information, advising him to call if he changes changes his mind. The next morning, James is picked up by his colleague, Courtney, on their way to the lab. During the drive, Courtney mentions she received word about an important announcement their boss, Edna, is making that day. The mention of the announcement jolts James's memory. This is exactly what the old man warned him about the previous night. James becomes increasingly convinced that the old man really was his future self. At the lab, Edna makes the announcement just as the old man had said. James becomes overwhelmed, questioning his next move. Should he confide in Courtney about the encounter with his future self and the looming invention of the time machine? He decides to keep the secret for now. James resolves to find the old man first, learn more about his future, and focus on the possibility of saving his parents. James leaves the lab and heads straight to the address the older version of himself had given him. When he arrives, he immediately bombards future James with questions. He wants to know what the future is like, when the time machine was built, and how far back in time they can travel. Seeing the eagerness and confusion in his younger self's eyes, future James tells him to calm down. The older James explains that the most important thing for young James to understand is this: he must stop devoting his life to the time machine project. He warns that James is sacrificing the best years of his life, time that he will never get back. Future James reveals that he built the time machine 12 years from now in collaboration with their boss, Edna. But there's a catch. The machine can only send someone to the past, not the future. That means future James is now stuck in this timeline and has no way back. Young James is thrilled, believing that with the time machine, he can finally save his parents. But future James shakes his head and explains that this is nothing more than a false hope. He tells James that certain events, like death, are fixed points in time that cannot be altered, no matter how hard one tries. By the time he understood this truth, future James had already spent years chasing an impossible goal. He had lost everything in the process: his sister Meredith, his friend Courtney, and the life he once had. Future James confesses that the real reason he traveled back was to stop his younger self from making the same mistakes. He urges young James to let go of the past, move forward, and cherish the time he has with Meredith and Courtney. If young James chooses to live a fulfilling life instead of obsessing over the time machine, future James will cease to exist in this timeline because the time machine would never be built. However, young James is still reluctant to abandon his dream of time travel. He insists that he can balance his research with taking care of his loved ones this time. Future James, seeing his younger self's determination, agrees to let him try, knowing that if James truly prioritizes his relationships, it might still change the future for the better. As they part ways, future James takes young James to the lake where he and Meredith are supposed to immerse their parents' ashes. He hopes this symbolic act will help young James move on. But young James is still not emotionally ready and leaves instead, carrying the burden of both his dreams and his unresolved grief. Later that day, James's sister, Meredith, goes to the lake alone. She feels hurt and disappointed that James didn't join her. With a heavy heart, she immerses their parents' ashes by herself, silently wishing her brother could have been there to share the moment. That evening, James is with Courtney when future James arrives, introducing himself as James's uncle. Young James isn't pleased with this sudden appearance, but future James insists he's only there to help strengthen James's relationships, particularly with Courtney. During their conversation, future James notices that young James is still wearing the necklace containing their parents' ashes, realizing he hasn't let go of the past. It's clear to him that James hasn't truly changed yet. The three of them have dinner together. Future James charms Courtney with his easygoing and engaging conversation, leaving young James both surprised and impressed. He wonders why Courtney has never connected with him this way. After dinner, as future James prepares to leave, young James stops him and asks how he was able to form such a strong bond with Courtney so effortlessly, something James has never managed to do. Future James explains that the reason is simple. Young James has always been too caught up in his own desires and ambitions, neglecting the people around him. He tells him that if he doesn't change, he will end up alone, just like future James. He urges him to start paying attention to the people who care about him, like Courtney and Meredith, before it's too late. Determined to improve, young James decides to act. He approaches Courtney and genuinely tries to have a meaningful conversation with her. To his relief, Courtney seems open to the change and even agrees to go on a date with him the next day. Feeling optimistic, young James tells future James that he's already starting to change. He's happy about the progress he's making and believes he's on the right track. However, future James remains skeptical. He warns that true change isn't about small steps, it's about a deep shift in priorities. He points out that if young James were truly changing, future James would already be disappearing from the timeline. The next day, young James and future James meet again. This time, future James teaches him how to meditate and encourages him to live in the present. During their session, future James asks why James didn't immerse their parents' ashes with Meredith at the lake the previous day. James admits that he still clings to the idea of using time travel to bring his parents parents back. He insists on keeping their ashes until he can make this happen. Hearing this, future James becomes visibly frustrated. He reminds young James that he's already explained how death is an unchangeable event and that his obsession with reversing it only led to a life of regret and loneliness. Future James urges him to let go of the past and focus on the present before it's too late. Feeling guilty, James later goes home and apologizes to Meredith for not being there with her at the lake. He promises to do better and to be more present in their relationship. That evening, James goes to a restaurant with Courtney. Determined to show her he's changing, he spends quality time with her, giving her his full attention and assuring her that he'll prioritize her as much as his work from now on. Courtney is delighted to hear this, and their evening goes well. After dinner, they return to James's house and the two begin to grow closer. However, just as they're about to become James suddenly recalls a formula related to his research. Unable to ignore it, he stops Courtney and rushes to write it down. Courtney, feeling hurt and angry that James still prioritizes work over her, even in such a moment, storms out of the house. The next day at the office, Courtney avoids James, still upset over what happened. James tries to talk to her, but she refuses to engage. Meanwhile, future James arrives at the office and quickly realizes that young James hasn't truly changed. Furious, he declares that he's done trying to help and that the only way to stop this obsession is to kill Edna, their boss, to ensure the time machine is never built. Panicked, young James pleads with future James not to take such an extreme step. He begs for one last chance to fix everything, promising to finally make real changes in his life. Young James was tired of dealing with old James. He couldn't accept everything his future self had told him and decided to take matters into his own hands. He wanted to build the time machine on his own and save his parents, no matter what the warnings were. Even though he knew his future and had been told it would ruin his life, James was determined to finish his research. To clear the way, James called the police and reported old James as a thief who had broken into his house. The police arrested old James, leaving James free to focus on his plan. Confident, he spoke to his boss, Edna, and told her the truth, that in the future they would create a time machine together. He suggested they start working on it now. Edna agreed and decided to announce the project the next day. Feeling optimistic, James met with Courtney and excitedly told her about becoming a partner in the lab. But Courtney wasn't impressed. She told James that none of this mattered to her because he only cared about his work and never made her a priority. Her words upset James, and he began to wonder if he was already making the same mistakes as his future self. Later, Courtney called James. She told him that old James had visited her and revealed everything, that he was James's future version, and his obsession with the time machine would ruin his life. Heartbroken, Courtney told James she was leaving him and moving to Switzerland, unable to stay in a relationship where she felt unimportant. The next day, Idna was ready to announce the time machine project. But as the announcement was about to happen, James started to realize his future self had been right all along. He needed to let go of the past and focus on the people in his life instead of chasing an impossible dream. With this realization, he rushed out to stop Courtney from leaving. At the same time, old James, who had been freed by Courtney, arrived at the lab. Desperate to stop the project, he tried to attack Edna, believing it was the only way to prevent the time machine from being built. But just as he was about to harm her, old James began to fade from existence. He realized that young James had chosen a different path, changing the future and erasing old James from the timeline. With a smile, old James disappeared, happy that his younger self had made the right choice. Meanwhile, James immersed his parents' ashes at the lake, finally accepting their loss and deciding to move forward with his life. He abandoned the time machine project and focused on the relationships he had neglected. The story ends in Switzerland, where James finds Courtney and apologizes sincerely. He tells her that from now on, his time and attention will belong to her, and they begin to rebuild their relationship. The final scene shows James and Courtney in a restaurant, happy and enjoying their new life. Around them, glimpses of alternate versions of James and Courtney appear, hinting at the many futures they could have had. The movie concludes on a hopeful and joyful note as James chooses love and happiness over regret and obsession.